My name is Bill Dorman, and I'm Vice President of the Friends of the Library. And I've been asked to introduce our speaker today.
Can they hear you in the back, Bill?
I don't know. Can you hear? You can't hear me. All right. You can't hear me, and you're in the front. All right. Then I'll speak into the microphone. So most often introductions of this sort begin with someone saying that it's a distinct pleasure. But understand that that's a rhetorical convention, not an expression of deep sentiment. I know that I've been introduced any number of times by people for whom it was not a distinct pleasure. Be that as it may, I'm introducing Michael Fitzgerald today, and it is indeed a distinct pleasure. For one thing, we're longtime friends and colleagues. I was on the committee in 1986 that hired him, and I can tell you that it was one of the best decisions the journalism program ever made. The thing I want to say about Mike, however, today is that when most faculty retire, they pretty much say the same thing. When you ask them, what are you going to do? And they say, I'm going to do some writing. In my case, for example, when people ask me, what are you doing when you're retired? And I did a bit of writing when I was on faculty, and then as I say, I'm doing childcare and sprinklers and the dishes. Michael, on the other hand, went out and did the writing. And that's going to be the subject of his talk today. Incidentally, since he retired, he's done some 325 columns for a weekly newspaper in upstate New York. And I've read many of them, and they are brilliant. They are wonderful examples of local journalism. Environmental issues, political issues, et cetera. He's now moved to the Bay Area and is heading the Finger Lakes Times West Coast Bureau, I believe. What he's going to discuss today is how he came to conceive of the idea of writing novels about a very hot issue, fracking. And I think the person that wrote about him, about these novels, that most impressed me with herself, a noted biologist and an environmental author, who said that it was Uncle Tom's Cabin, not economic data, that turned the page on slavery. It was the grapes of wrath, not demographic reports, that opened a nation's eyes to the Dust Bowl and its consequences. Out of that tradition comes Michael J. Fitzgerald's The Fracking War. And we at the Friends of the Library are exceedingly pleased to have him here today. Michael?
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. Everybody hear me now? Yes? Yes. Can you hear? Yes, okay. This is so deja vu, coming to a podium with a whole handful of materials like this, that just like when I was teaching. Thank you, Bill, for that excellent introduction. I'm reminded that every time Bill Dorman has talked, and I've gotten to introduce Bill a few times, I often feel like if I have to follow him after he's introduced me, I just can say, Bill, here's my notes. Could you just give my talk for me, please? And just handle it that way. First, I want to thank the Friends of the Library for inviting me. This is an honor to be invited back to home turf to do this. I really do appreciate it. And I appreciate Bill's excellent introduction. Before I get to the sort of meat and potatoes about the fracking war and fracking justice and that other book called The Devil's Pipeline, which somebody said was aptly named, or subtly named, is what I heard somebody say. I wanted to use. I'm going to do this and see if anyone knows who it is. I'm channeling here. I'm going to give a little history. Okay. Yes, few people got it. All right. And that little history is that about 12 years ago, more or less, I can't keep track of the years anymore, I set 3 goals for myself. These are not bucket list. I don't even like that expression. Thank you very much. And the goal was I would learn a foreign language, become proficient in a foreign language, not become fluent, that I would learn how to play a musical instrument, and that I would publish a novel, which, by the way, is different than writing a novel. I would publish a novel. A big distinction there, really. My wife and I lived in Mexico for 6 years after sailing a sailboat out the Golden Gate and ending up south of Puerto Vallarta. And while the Spanish that I learned would be closer to the English that you would learn in Appalachia, because we lived in a little fishing village and where most of the people had about a fourth grade education, the equivalent of a fourth grade education, we're pretty good at fourth grade Spanish right now. So I was proficient. The musical instrument I picked up was a ukulele. It was small enough to carry on the sailboat. It also was pretty easy because if you didn't know the chord, those of you who play music, you know, you just sing louder with the ukulele. And my granddaughter thinks I'm a rock star, so as far as that is concerned, it's good. And then that brings me to the fracking war, which was, I'll tell you all about. But I've made those 3 goals, and then the goal after the fracking war was published was that I would continue to publish novels as long as my fingers could keep tapping on the keyboard. I had originally told Bill Dorman that what I was going to do was I was going to have the slides, and I was going to do the thing that you don't want to see, you know, about hydrofracking. But I determined very quickly that I really didn't need to do that, because if you read the book, The Fracking War, that was the reason that I wrote it in the first place, was that the book itself would fill in the data on everything you needed to know to be horrified. So I'm not going to do that, but I am going to talk a lot about the book. And I wanted to talk first about, you know, why the fracking war? Why a book about fracking? The Fracking War actually isn't my first novel. It's my first published novel. Like probably some other people in this room, I have some other novels in the drawer that will get taken out eventually. But it was the issue of fracking that really grabbed me to want to write a novel. I discovered it, and if you've read The Fracking War, this will sound familiar because it's all in the introduction and the first sort of preface part of the book. My wife and I were driving up a highway in upstate New York, and we saw these signs. And they said, "No fracking." The only reference I had for fracking was a television program called Battlestar Galactica, in which the people would go around saying "frack" all the time. And I couldn't understand why somebody would go to all the trouble of having signs made up. They were very nice political signs that said "no fracking." I learned very quickly from reading the local media what it was all about, because this technology of getting natural gas and oil out of the ground was happening right across the border in Pennsylvania, only about 30 miles away. And it was, there was a big push to have it happen in the state of New York. And the state of New York, people rose up to stop it. That was the start of it. That's when I was learning about it, and I had just started working for the Finger Lakes Times newspaper in Geneva, New York. And the more I learned about it, the more horrified I was about what was going on, the water pollution, all the things that actually I could go on about that for the whole afternoon. But it wasn't until one afternoon I was in a winery in that region of the Finger Lakes near Seneca Lake, and which, by the way, is referenced frequently in the books, and I'll explain a little bit more about that too. But I was having a glass of wine with a group of people from right around there, most of them farmers, farmers and vineyard owners. And a woman came in from one of the other wineries. And she was one of the people, if you've ever gone wine tasting, which I can't imagine anyone in this room hasn't gone wine tasting, but if you've gone wine tasting, she was one of the people that pours the wine for you and says, "This is the excellent Merlot, this is whatever." And she was very, very upset and angry. And what had happened was a group of people from Pennsylvania who worked in the gas fields had come into the winery where she worked, demanded their little glasses of wine, and they started making fun of the signs in front of the winery that said, "No fracking." And they told her in no uncertain terms, I think they even used the expression "girly," but it was a long time ago that this happened. They said, "We don't care about your little signs out there. We are coming to New York, we are going to frack, and we are going to get the gas from this place, and there's really nothing you can do about it." Well, they obviously didn't understand the women that live in upstate New York, particularly that part, because she got feisty enough that they eventually got thrown out of the winery for this sort of altercation. But when she came to the winery where I was, just a couple of miles down the road, she was still, as we used to say, all flaps up. And I stood there in a small group of people, all males, but a small group, and I watched these guys listen to her description of these people who later, when you read the Fracking War, they're called gas bags, but that's another issue. And I watched their eyes, and they were getting mad. And I stood and watched them for a while, and I listened, and then I started to think about these guys. These were all people that had rifle racks in the backs of their cars. I knew at least one of them carries a pistol underneath the seat of his truck, just for protection. They aren't really NRA type guys. It's guns, it's upstate New York, it's deer hunting country. And I thought, my God, if those people ever came in here and tried to force fracking on this community, there could be a war. There could be a fracking war. There could be, and that's where the title came from. And 2 more glasses of wine when I went home. I sat down, sketched a few notes, and the very next morning I wrote the first chapter of the book as fast as I could, furiously, for the Fracking War. And it's similar to the chapter that's actually that appears in the book. And if life were a movie, I would have then spent the rest of the summer madly writing this book, sending it off to HarperCollins, and it would have become a bestseller and probably a movie by now. It didn't work out quite that way. What really happened was I spent the rest of the summer going probably to the same winery in the same afternoon with a lot of the same guys talking about the same issues. But that fall, when we went to Mexico and spent time in that same Mexican village learning our Appalachian Spanish, I started writing the book. And then later that year, we were in a condo in Puerto Vallarta, which is where I actually finished the draft of the Fracking War. I sat down and I started doing about 1,000 words a day. And for those of you that want to write a novel, by the way, 1,000 words a day, 70 days later, you have a novel. It might not be publishable, but you have your 70,000 words. James Lee Burke, I don't know how many of you like the author James Lee Burke. He writes great fiction, sort of detective stories. He has an expression in his books. It's about prison, but it's applicable to writing. He says when someone's in prison, they're stacking time. And when people ever talk to me about writing, particularly writing long-form journalism or novels, I say, you're stacking paragraphs. That's kind of what you're doing, just one paragraph right after another. And so I stacked paragraphs until I got to it turned out to be 80,000 words, which was too long, I think, but the publisher took it anyway. And we ended up with the Fracking War. So what I'm going to do is answer some of the questions that people normally ask me. And one of the first ones, which somebody actually asked me just before we started here a few minutes ago, they said, "Why did you write a novel? Why didn't you do nonfiction? Why didn't you write one of those great scientific tomes with charts, graphs, and 8x10 color glossy photographs with descriptions on the back?" And the reason I didn't is there were a number of those books already out there. In fact, I referenced them in the preface to the Fracking War, a very excellent one by a journalist in upstate New York. There's a lot of good nonfiction books out there about hydrofracking, should you want to read them and be so inclined to dive into the deep science that goes along with them. But I didn't think that was hitting the audience that I wanted. I wanted an audience that wasn't reading the newspaper articles, that wasn't paying attention to the science of what was going on. And I wanted to hit them with a story. Ideally, it would have been a movie. Ideally, I would have written a script, and the script would have gone to Hollywood, and Hollywood would have made it into a movie. In fact, I thought for a bit when the book was almost done about trying to do the screenplay myself, and then a friend of mine sent me a book. It's called Screenplay for Dummies. When I told her what I was going to do, and that pretty much iced my chances of ever. I decided that maybe that wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. So I decided that the dry statistical approach to it wasn't going to work. That said, and I will say this probably several times in the next whatever number of minutes, the science in the fracking war and in fracking justice and the Devil's Pipeline and a fourth book that I just started a few months ago called The Wolverine Rebellion. That one's also well named, I think. The science is all solid. It's the stories that's the stories that the fiction is. And I've had to explain that to an awful lot of people who look at it and don't understand that the story is fiction. But honestly, if I wrote the actual sort of truth that goes along with it in the book, people wouldn't believe it anyway. I mean, they barely believe some of the things that go on as it is. So that's kind of where that comes from. Plus, in a piece of fiction, I can say, for example, that the water is polluted by the hydrofracking process, and certainly the process of getting rid of the water. I can just say it. I don't have to go to the company that did the drilling and say, well, you know, people say that this is a problem, and have them say, no, it's not. There's nothing statistical about that's been proven, which, by the way, is what they say consistently. And it's infinitely more persuasive, for example, for me to describe, as I do in the book in several places, children who are sick, covered with boils and all the things that have happened, rather than say, there have been a number of instances in which children have become sick from this. So you can do so many things in fiction that you just can't do in a nonfiction piece. So the other question or idea that frequently comes up, because I've been speaking to a lot of writers groups too, is they say, these characters, where do these characters come from? How do you do that? Where do you come up with these characters? And I have one of my friends who has written several novels, says that what she does is she sees a movie, she said, when she writes. And she kind of writes what she's looking at. That would be a lot easier than what I have to go through, frankly. I wish I could just watch movies and write a narrative and say, oh, well, then this happened, and then this happened. When I write, all of the fiction that I've written has been pretty much the same in terms of the way it works. I come up with that beginning, as I did in the Fracking War, or in Fracking Justice, there's a similar sort of dramatic beginning to it. And then when I sit down to write the meat and potatoes, the real book, it's more like I'm not looking at a movie, I'm looking at a stage, and the actors on the stage come on, literally come out of the wings. And some of them are characters that I've said, I need a cop who's slightly overweight, who has a swagger or whatever. And sometimes the characters that come on stage aren't people that I figured that I was really looking for at all. They just kind of appear. And people that haven't written fictions they go, no, that isn't. But that is the way it works for me. Characters kind of appear, and I kind of work them into it. I'm more like a director of a stage play, and I hope that I can write as fast as the characters are acting on the stage. I'll use an example of this too, of where I'm frequently surprised by what characters in the novel. In this novel, Fracking Justice, and the other ones. I was finishing up the Fracking War. Actually, I wasn't finishing up. It was kind of midstream, now that I think about it. And I came down from the condo where I was to go to the beach, which was the afternoon routine. The routine was I write in the morning, my wife would go out and teach Zumba or some other thing. And at the end of my writing day, which was noon, beer o'clock, I would head down to the beach. And on this particular day, it had been quite the morning in the Fracking War. And I came down and I slumped down into one of the sort of lawn chairs that they had on the beach in Puerto Vallarta. And I just was kind of like, oh. And my wife says, what's wrong? Are you okay? I said, someone died. Now, my wife and I have 4 children, 3 grandchildren, brothers, sisters, a large group of friends. a whole tribe of people who we hang out with. And she just didn't know. And I said, and I looked at her and I realized what I had said. And I went, oh, no, 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 no. I said, Walter died. Walter died. She said, who's Walter? I said, well, he's the publisher of the newspaper. And then she said, well, what she said is probably unrepeatable right now, but she was not happy. And I realized that this fictional character, you know, was how important this fictional character was to me, that it actually affected, you know. And the other thing is that his death in the book, those of you who haven't read the book, I'm sorry, it's a spoiler. It's page 172 or whatever it is. It surprised me. I didn't know poor Walter wasn't going to make it out of the hospital, and he didn't. So that, you know, that sort of thing can happen. Even more mysterious, and I don't know, you have lots of folks come in and talk to you every year. Let's see if anyone else has this happen to them. Any other fiction authors have this one happen to them. In writing the book called The Devil's Pipeline, and I'm going to pull it out here. This is what a book looks like before it becomes a book. It looks an awful lot like a student's notebook, right? I had a character who one day just appeared. Now, I know that sounds strange, but that's exactly what happened. What the main antagonist in this book, who was the head of an energy company, suddenly announced to some of the other characters that he was bringing in a special consultant to handle some of the dirty work. And this special consultant's name was Marsden Weasley, or Mars for short. I read that, I typed that name, I looked at it, and I thought, have I been reading too much Charles Dickens or something? I mean, where did a name like Marsden Weasley come from? But there was Marsden Weasley. And so I continued on, and it wasn't until, I mean, he is introduced into the book. He is met by some of the people, and it wasn't until a little later in the book that I actually got to describe him. But I think I'll read just this brief description to you, and you'll see what my problem was as an author. See if he should just jump right off the page at me, actually. He's that kind of character. This is just a couple of paragraphs, but it's from a scene in which he's on an airplane with one of the other characters. Rod Manlin, who is the other character, shifted in his seat, aware that the female flight attendant at the front of the cabin could not take her eyes off his huge first-class seatmate. Marsden Weasley was looking out the window at the clouds, his head bent down so he could peer out. Christ, Manlin thought, she's staring at him, but I can barely even look at him. Marsden Weasley was as tall as Calvin Bovenet. He's another character in the book who's large. He had broad shoulders and arms that hung down disproportionately to his height. He didn't share Bovenet's resemblance to an NFL football player. He appeared more gangly, but he was still an imposing figure to any average height or average weight person. But what had the flight attendant staring, and what had scared the hell out of the hotel desk clerk the day before, was Weasley's sloped forehead, nearly across a nearly bald head, where small tufts of fiercely black hair popped up in a half dozen spots like misspent sagebrush. Plus, Weasley had an overbite so dramatic it made it seem as if his lower jaw belonged to someone else, had been grafted onto his skull. Malin thought, he looks like the love child of Quasimodo and the bride of Frankenstein. After I read that chapter, I thought, what am I going to do with this guy? I mean, and I've created this monster sort of person. What am I going to do? And I honestly had no idea how he fit in the book, really. I mean, he was a thuggish character with an overbite that you could, keep an SUV in the shade, underneath and everything. But later, it became clear to me what part he played in the book. And in fact, he was more than just a consultant to the head of the antagonist, to the head of this energy company. He was his closest friend. And it turned out, thank God, that they had grown up together in an orphanage in Iowa. And it turned out that this particular character is pivotal to the whole end of the book and the whole sort of sequence of things. So I had a character there who came out of nowhere, and mercifully enough, you know, it all worked out for us. I can't imagine who would play Marsden Weasley in a movie or what they would do with him, but it will still be interesting if that ever happens. You know, another thing I get frequently is people they do ask about names, like Marsden Weasley. Well, that one just came out I can't explain that one. But I only have one thing to say about writing fiction and names. Thank God for Google. Thank God. If I decided to write a book about, say, about a university, and I'm sitting at my computer somewhere and I pick a name and I go, William Dorman, that's a pretty good name. I can go onto Google and immediately find out that, oh, there is a William Dorman who has university connections here, and I better not use that name. So when I'm writing and I need a character's name, I use Google. And there are some pretty strange name combinations you can come up with, and you Google it, and sure enough, they're an insurance agent in Dubuque. Or they own a car dealership in Louisiana, or something like that. No, you know, it's really, it's very interesting. But the part of it is, and I mentioned Charles Dickens before, I happen to love Charles Dickens, not so much for his style, but for a lot of the devices that he uses, not the least of which is that if you ever read a Dickens novel, you know that every single character in that book will be accounted for at the end of the book, somehow. Dickens famously once forgot to put in a dog that appeared early, because you know he used to write these things for his books really for newspapers. They appeared in serial. He actually wrote an extra chapter in a book to account for a dog. So I love that about him. I also love the names that he comes up with, because the names say everything. Perhaps the most famous of those was a character from the book David Copperfield. And he was an accountant and a money guy, and he always went like this, and his name was Uriah Heep. Uriah Heep. And if you saw the movie version, which starred Freddie Bartholomew and W.C. Fields and some other folks, W.C. Fields would go and say, would just angrily say, Heep, Heep. He's the heart of everything. Heep. And it was a great. I loved that name, Uriah Heep. When I was naming people, it was a little more complicated because of that Google factor. You know, you had to make sure you didn't accidentally step on someone's real name. So the energy magnate in the first book, I had a very specific thing in mind. I wanted him to sound kind of arrogant, kind of prep school, kind of entitled, kind of like an awful lot of people we'd probably point to these days. And I came up with a name, and Google let me get away with it and said, no, there's no one with this name. There's no one. This can be your bad guy. And his name is Grayson Oliver Delacroix III. Because I wanted a little Louisiana oil money thrown in there, and that was the Delacroix. And again, I'll put the spoiler out there, but if you think about his initials for just a minute, Grayson Oliver Delacroix, it fits right into the last chapter in the book and something that happens. The energy magnate bad guy, and I'll talk about why I use these guys consistently, but in the second book, in Fracking Justice, his real name is Luther Burnside, which is pretty pedestrian, you know, and it was supposed to be something a little different, but there is no Luther Burnside, at least that could remotely be considered somebody that would be heading up an oil company, certainly in Missouri. But what makes him interesting is that he's kind of a hulking character too, and his nickname when he was in school was Luca Brasi. If you know who that is, that's from The Godfather, okay? And so in the second book, not only is Luther Burnside, I almost said Luther Burbank, and the reason that is because autocorrect wants to change it whenever I would type it. And so my proofreaders had a tough time with that second book. Anyway, he is enamored, as he's become a powerful man, he's enamored with that idea of Luca Brasi, and he actually in the book starts dressing in this sort of Italian, thuggish character. Another character whose name I picked up, and again, sometimes you use stereotypes. I needed a smart computer guy. So I picked up the name Eli Gupta. And that was also after watching a television program, and I'm trying to remember what the name of it was. It was about the television newsroom. Maybe it was called. No, not West Wing. It was the
newsroom.
The newsroom with with McAvoy. Howard McAvoy. Yeah. I put that in, and I don't have to put that much of a description, and people who've read the book can see him. They say, Eli Gupta, oh, okay, and they get the idea of a thin Indian. He happens to be Pakistani, but that's all right. And then in a nod to Charles Dickens, one other name, and then we'll move on to something else. I have a character in the second book who is now following through. He's in the second book, and he'll be in the next two. He's in the third book, and he'll be in the fourth. His name is Keith Everlight. And Dickens used to name people like that, Everlight or whatever. And I named him Keith Everlight kind of in honor of someone who I worked with many years ago. Not so much an honor, perhaps isn't exactly the way to describe it. But Keith Everlight is about 5 feet 6 inches tall. And that's wearing his boots that raise him up 2 inches. And he's kind of a scrappy character. And the Everlight is because he's also a welterweight boxing champion who just happens to have graduated from college in journalism, and now and that comes into play in the book, as you can imagine, too. Keith Everlight. Characters change. Again, as I said earlier, I don't know sometimes about characters what they're going to do, but in the second book, I created a police chief who I thought was really a good corrupt character. He took money from the gas company. He was fixing people, who were getting arrested for things, all kinds of stuff. By the end of the book, he saved the day. He turned into a good guy. It just happened. The same is happening with a character who was in the second book. In the third book, he reappears, much to the chagrin of everybody. He's terrified. He's sort of a terrifying character until they realize that he's a changed man. He's out of prison, and while he was in prison, he became a Buddhist. So, something I had to do a little bit of research on in order to explain that bit of transformation for somebody that did what he did. Another question that frequently comes up is newspaper. The book, Fracking War, Fracking Justice, they all have a newspaper kind of at the center of them. And the reason for that is probably painfully obvious, but I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist my whole life. I'm still a journalist. I write a column. I also write things now in the Bay Area. And it's very familiar territory for me. But there's another reason for it. It's very easy to make the books very current by simply adding sort of current events into the book as they're happening. Some people that have read The Fracking War have said, boy, I have trouble distinguishing between what your characters are talking about and what's really happening. And then I'll say, well, that's because they are talking about what's really happening, because as I'm writing the book, I'm paying attention to environmental problems here and there. And this is not a new device. There was I can't remember. I think I found his name yesterday. Yes, Lawrence Block. I don't know how many of you used to read Lawrence Block novels. Well, if you read Lawrence Block, you know that every once in a while in a Lawrence Block novel, his main character, I can't remember the name. He had several. Would be working on a case, and then he would then in the book he would say, and I was getting hungry, so I went to the sink. I went to the kitchen, I made a sandwich, and I leaned over the sink and I ate it. And so I was at a writers' conference, and someone explained to me that the reason that was in there was because when Lawrence Sanders would get hungry, he would simply put it in the book. He would just add it in as a thing. And he said, well, why? He says, characters have to eat too, right? And I realized that, well, I suppose that's it. But in my case, what I'm doing is I'm just trying to add that dimension. And of course, what I'm doing is I'm explaining a local, maybe a more local problem than what the national thing is. And that's another reason for the journalism thing. I'm very familiar with small towns, and I'm familiar with the kind of issues that happen in the small towns, because I was a newspaper editor in several small towns in California. And they're a microcosm of what goes on the big stage, you know, in the big show. So, another thing, another area that usually the science types ask me this, and there's a few of them here. They say, wait a minute now, you say the science is sound in this. Well, how do you do your research? That's easy. I do the research just the way any journalist does. I read everything I can get my hands on, and I ask the smart people who understand things to tell me what's going on. And so that goes not just for the science part of it, but the research also goes for the political part of it. The final scene in the fracking war, which involves a school bus on the Cross Bronx Expressway, and it also involves a truck of fracking fluid. It doesn't end all that well, by the way. Came out of a public hearing that someone sent me a video of before a New York State Commission on Highway Safety. Now, at that meeting, there were 3 more board members of the safety group. There was a representative of a fracking company, and there was 1 reporter sitting in the room. You could see it on the videotape. And it was all about the danger of having a school bus on the Cross Bronx Expressway and having it mixed in with these trucks with this toxic material. Well, I took that little snippet of information and expanded it into actually most of the end of that particular book. So that was a hard part of the book to actually write, but it worked out okay, and I think in the end. Also in the fracking war, another sort of science thing that happened is I was looking for sort of making a prediction, because some of the things that are going on in this particular industry are pretty predictable. I mean, the pollution's predictable. One of the problems, and again, I don't want to go into great detail, is that in this technology, a lot of really bad water is produced. I'm talking about millions of gallons. Every time you drill one of these wells, it's anywhere from 5 to 10 million gallons of water that, when it's recovered, is not actually recovered. It has to be taken and disposed of. When it's disposed of, by the way, it usually causes an earthquake wherever it's disposed of. So I was reading up about all of the efforts to clean this water. No one's been able to do it. If you really want to strike it rich, figure out how to clean that water from this, because no one's been able to even come close. But there is a life form that lives deep in the earth, and I'm going to mispronounce it here. It's Archaea. It's not a bacteria. It's not a virus. It's sort of a strange. We've got some science people here who can explain it better. But it's huge. It's everywhere. Anyway, it's one of the things that the natural gas companies and the oil companies try to kill when they're using this hydrofracking process, because anything that's going to slow the gas down from coming back up, or the oil, they don't want. So they put a lot of biocides down there. So I thought about this, and I thought, well, you know, we're always looking for, I almost pulled my microphone out, sorry. We're always looking for environmental green solutions to sort of things like this. Suppose some genetic engineer could trick the Archaea into wanting to eat toluene, for example, or benzene, or xylene, or any one of these many awful chemicals that they're shooting down the well. So that's what this part of the book was all about, doing that. Well, of course, in my novelist mind, I had the genetic engineering go astray. Surprise, it went astray, and caused a lot of fun in there. 6 months after the fracking war first hit the streets, I read a newspaper article about some scientists who were trying to figure out how to use a biological entity to go down the well with the water to break up this stuff. No doubt genetically engineered. I don't know what they were using to make it happen. How am I doing on time there, Professor? You're not looking. I don't have a clock.
It's 3:45, so.
I'm right on time. Okay, I just got that signal. Okay. I want to just talk two more things. One is about the progression of these books. The Fracking War really, if I were to put it shorthand, was a primer on hydrofracking and talking about all the problems with it, political, social, scientific. But it was for people that really just were interested in it and wanted a good story. And that's been, a number of people have told me it's a good story. And I'm gonna take that at face value, that's a good story. Fracking Justice, I wrote in a similar vein, but it really looks at the way this technology through these gas companies has affected communities in a very, very bad way, and all the institutions within them. The Devil's Pipeline is an extension of those things because all of that gas and oil has to go somewhere, and it's going through pipelines. And right now, there's about, in the United States alone, there's about 350,000 pipelines that are charted. There's probably twice that are uncharted, that are smaller lines that and companies don't even have to keep track of by law. So there's a lot of intrigue that goes along with that. The last book in this series, I don't know if it'll be the last or not, but it's the last so far, is called The Wolverine Rebellion. And that's a little bit of an outgrowth about some of the things that are happening in the world today, all around us, in which people are rebelling against corporate interests. I'm using the energy world because I'm familiar with that now, and also the Wolverines, if you read the first book, are sort of a group that started their doings in the first book. And if you want to see the movie about what they were like, read the book Red Dawn, or watch the movie Red Dawn. It's a Reagan era movie that's still pretty good. So last but not least, and then we'll cut it off. It's about success of books. People always say, some people say, how many books you sell? And I say, not as many as Stephen King, not as many as Louise Penny, definitely not as many as James Lee Burke. But I've sold some books. I've sold quite a few books. I don't actually, believe it or not, keep track of how many books I've sold. I just get a report every once in a while, and I get a check every once in a while. And it's not a very big check, but I go out for dinner often on it, and it's fine. I don't measure the success that way, although I would be happy to measure the success that way at some point in the future. But I want to tell you two quick anecdotes. The first. Last year, a high school classmate of mine contacted me and said she wanted a copy of the second book, Fracking Justice, and she had just read The Fracking War, and she was really excited to read the second book. And I said, well, that's great, sure. And I was going to inscribe it for her. And I said, well, I'm glad you liked the first book. And she says, oh, I had to read it. My son, who works for, and I can't use the name, a major energy company in Houston, Texas. They all seem to be in Houston, Texas, or maybe they were in Houston, Texas, what's left of it. She said, my son, who works for this energy company in Houston, Texas, said that in his company, the fracking war is absolutely required reading. They can't put it down. He says, you nailed it. And they're not all real happy about it, but they do it. So I took that as, okay, that's one. That's a big one. The second anecdote's a little more personal. A few months after the fracking war came out, I was at a demonstration near Watkins Glen, New York, and there was a large group of people there, probably 100, 150 people, all protesting a gas storage situation. And they're all walking around, they all have signs, and this one woman had a sign, and I saw her make eye contact across about the distance between me and Don Girth, right over here, about the same distance. And she started moving towards me, very slowly, looking. And then she started to close the ground between us. And she's got this big sign. I mean, it's big, you know, and it's got some Native American symbols on it and everything. And I'm thinking, I'm not too sure about this. I'm not too sure at all. And as she got closer, she got a big smile on her face, and she dropped her sign, and she stopped and she said, are you Michael Fitzgerald? And I said the same thing I always say, yes, unless you have a warrant. And she says, oh, and she came up, and then I knew I was in for it, and she threw her arms around me and gave me a huge bear hug. An embarrassing bear hug, you know. I wanted to say, there's people looking here, you know, come on. And she pushed me back and she says, I read your book about a week ago, and she said, you're the reason I'm here today. You're the reason I'm here. She said, I read that book. I can't let this happen in this state. And I thought, oh, be still my heart, you know? So, and I've had lots of other, I could tell you a bunch of anecdotes like that, but that to me is the success. And that's what got me writing Fracking Justice immediately after I finished the Fracking War. And it's what kind of keeps me going with these books. So with all that, and I need to take a drink of water, I think we have a few minutes for a couple of questions, if anybody's got questions.
Well,
Gene Torkum.
it's interesting to hear you talk about characters coming on stage and so forth, but surely you must start out with a sense of where this story is going.
I'd like to say yes, in a general sense. In a general sense,
plot.
general. I have colleagues that are like me, and I also have colleagues that would do a flow chart right here. You know, they'll do, okay, these are the 12 characters. This is what's going to happen, and then this is going to happen. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. I can't really write like that because I use the word organic. It's not really the right word, but I generally have the characters kind of dictate what happens. Now, the start of the book tells you usually dictates where the book is going. But where it's going to end up, I'm not really sure. I would not have predicted, for example, in The Devil's Pipeline, what happened at the tail end of that book. I just wouldn't have predicted it. Now, that's either a strength of mine or like a fabulous weakness, but it seems to work out. One of the things that you've probably heard this from other authors, when I write a draft of a novel, I have anywhere from 3 to 5 what we call beta readers, people that read it before it goes anywhere. And they read it, and they give it, and they say, this is what I think, and they give it back. And almost always they have very good ideas to throw in there. But I have yet to have anyone say, no, your plot's off. You know, this plot doesn't work. Now, I don't know if that's because I have a good imagination or world events dictate what happens, but I don't plot it as carefully as what I think you're suggesting, Gene. Yeah. Other questions? Christy.
From 17 years ago. Anyway,
Seems like just yesterday to me, Christy.
are you using fictionalized locations, or are you naming real towns, real locations?
That's a good question. In the Fracking War, I begin with a newspaper in a town called Horseheads, New York, which you would think, who would ever name a town Horseheads? But there is a real Horseheads, New York. It's not far from where I live in Watkins Glen, lived in Watkins Glen. And I picked it specifically because I kind of knew the town, and I knew there was no newspaper there. And I knew just enough about it to know, and the other thing was that town is very close to the Pennsylvania border. Almost all the rest of the names in this book and the other books are fictionalized. It wasn't until after this book came out that I realized I could have really stepped in it by using a real location. That said, this summer I was in Horseheads, New York, having a cup of tea in a diner, and the person I was with, a politician, said, "Is this the Millie's Diner that you wrote about in the book?" I didn't see anybody named Millie in there, so no. But again, and you're coming up with the names of towns can be a little tricky. In the Devil's Pipeline, I needed the name for a county and a town, and so I used the last name of a winemaker from upstate New York. It's Boyette County in Boyette, Iowa. There is no Boyette County in Iowa, or Boyette, but he'll be flattered when the book comes out, probably. I might even get a bottle of wine, I don't know. In the back first, yes.
So, how does the series affect your life outside? Like, as a columnist, are there certain issues that you have to be careful writing about?
Not really, because I am a columnist, I can write pretty much whatever I want to. I am not very popular with energy companies in general, and some local ones in upstate New York in specific, but it doesn't really affect my life. Now, other aspects of that column probably impact a lot more, because the gas companies really. I'm a columnist. I've written this book, but with the exception of that Houston company, I don't ever get any nasty grams from Rex Tillerson. You know, I guess is what you're asking.
You can write about environmental issues.
Yes. In fact, that's kind of my specialty is environmental issues.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you do all your research up front and then start writing, or do you do research as you go along? And also, is there a possible movie and movies and books?
Oh my God, yes. I hope there's a possible movie in this. I have high hopes of a movie at some point. Maybe some good screenwriter will take all these books and kind of shuffle them together like a big deck of cards. I have worked with some people in Hollywood. I have a good friend who works for Sony Pictures. Now he's not the movie guy. He works in the film end of it, but I have high hopes. I did work with one screenwriter, and I learned that there's a real danger that the screenwriter reads your book or books, and they see a whole different story. And I wrote an environmental thriller, and the screenwriter I worked with, very briefly, wanted to turn it into a love story. And I said, no. This is about children and illness and dangers and corruption and whatever. And yes, and by the way, in the new book, I was with some people last weekend, and the women all wanted to know, is there a love story in it? This is not to be stereotypical, but they did. They asked me that. And the men wanted to know how many things blew up. Boys, you know? What are you going to do? So.
How about the research? When you do it all up front or as you go along?
I'm doing it as I go along because I'm bouncing off of events that are happening. You know, wow, events that are happening. The last book is that I've just started writing is really about civil liberties and how I can imagine the government using energy and not energy regulation, but energy safety and independence as a rubric to quash people's civil liberties. And that's already happening, by the way. That's already happening. Again, you talk about research. I just read something about 3 days ago in which Jeff Sessions and various Congress types are talking about making people that are protesting, get them labeled as eco-terrorists. And you know, it's like, oh, that couldn't happen. Well, it actually happened about 8 or 9 years ago. I covered a trial for Reuters right here in Sacramento in which some people who had done some arguably not very nice things to a logging company were tried as terrorists. And they were sent to jail too, if I remember correctly. So, any other questions? I think time's just about up. Well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you.